You are cold, child. Aramis's world was a smoking smother of darkness and pain. She could not move, she was only vaguely aware of the voice. We have a use for you. A mass of frozen splinters sealed her eyes. How long had she been here? We would have you find something for us, something which was lost. The voice swirled around like smoke, echoed inside her mind. Though terrifying, it was something to focus on amid the surrounding nothing. Who was speaking? Answer, said the voice, convincing and commanding. Aramis paused, as if in response, her perception began to dim and she felt the crushing darkness closing in around her once more. There was no fight here. This was no choice. She remembered her people. Yes, she thought, and the pain seized. Gather those who would serve you, and know you serve us. A surge of images filled her mind, tendrils of inky vapor trailing through the stars. Hidden vessels secreted amongst long-forgotten treasures, a whisper rising to roar, the great machine beginning to awaken, and then, from everywhere, shattering. Arask sat in the heart of his catch, lit only by the weak amber glow of his view screen. He frowned as he charted another trip through the Themis cluster with a quarter load of phase glass. The job would barely pull enough to cover the voyage, and ether reserves were dangerously low. How could his crew... A blinking light caught his attention, chatter on a long, dormant channel. Arask leaned forward in his seat, his ancient leathers creaking as he moved. He tapped at the screen with one gnarled claw. The missive was direct and merciless. A jagged grin crept over his face. She hadn't changed. The comm system squawked from disuse. Below decks, a patchwork band of dregs and marauders looked up in confusion. A call's gone out. Arask's voice rasped from the speakers. Raise the old flag. We sail once more. And if Mara demands his extradition? Ikora crosses her arms behind her back and arched her eyebrow at Zavala. The Vanguard leaders were sequestered in Zavala's office. A terse missive from Petrovenge lay at issue between them. Then we'll happily accommodate her, the commander responded with a wry smile. But I suspect Mara's attention is elsewhere. Perhaps she needs a reminder, Ikora floated casually. It would give us the political cover to act. It would. Zavala frowned. But even if we evict him, I'm reluctant to send him back to the reef. Ikora chuckled dryly. A fate worse than death. I can only imagine what the Techians have dreamed up for him. Besides, the commander said, turning an asylum seeker over to the Awoken would needlessly provoke the Elixni. He tried to keep his tone light, but it betrayed him as he felt the seeds of an argument starting to form. True, Ikora shrugged. But the spider's very presence in the city is a provocation. You saw what happened when the House of Light arrived, all the unjustified hatred. Zavala grunted in reluctant acknowledgement. In Spider's case, the anger would be entirely justified, Ikora pressed, trying to forestall Zavala's inevitable objection. He would give critics of Elixni resettlement plenty of fresh ammunition. It would set relations back by a year, and we've only just stabilized. You're right, he conceded. Spider is more trouble than he's worth. Ikora sighed. If I'm right, then why are you about to fight me on this? Zavala smiled softly. They knew each other so well. 2 reasons, he replied. First, Spider is somewhat of a cultural liaison between the Elixni and humanity. He was welcoming to Guardians when most of the shore was still a war zone. Is that how you're framing his ghost shell collection? Cultural exchange? Ikora wrinkled her nose in distaste. That's a mark against on my ledger. Mine as well, Zavala replied. But we have to accept the Elixni for who they are, warts and all. If we're going to live with them, we have to understand them. And nobody understands both sides like Spider. And second, Ikora prompted, we never know who might become an ally. Zavala gestured in the direction of the Elixni quarter below. The number of Guardians that Mithrax has killed over the years, he trailed off with a shake of his head. But now Mithrax fights for the last city as his home, he continued, turning back to Ikora. It was unimaginable even a decade ago, but here we are. And in Ido, I see the first real hope for collective peace in my lifetime, not just a ceasefire, but a real peace. Zavala shrugged. In a century or two, who knows what Spider might become? Ikora narrowed her eyes and pressed her lips together in firm disapproval. Zavala smiled to himself, knowing he had won. Erismorn's workspace was organized, clean. A camp stove, a burned work, a crate of rations to keep her fed until the next supply drop to Luna. A metal work table with a neat arrangement of medical equipment, carefully kept. Half of a thrall's skull, a saw resting at its side. A collection of discarded chitin, a skein of hive leather. Drifter picked up a jar from a shelf. The container was filled with pickled hive eyeballs, the green dimmed by death. You live like this? Drifter asked, incredulous. Eris looked at him with a frown. What do you mean? Like what? Drifter gestured around the room. When she said nothing, he continued. You called the derelict a heap. She switched on one of the harsh halogen lamps hanging over her work table. The light cast everything in hard lines of shadow. It is. So what do you call this? He shook the jar of eyeballs. They rolled and thumped together in the glass container before settling into a teeming stare. Eris silently returned her gaze to the reliquary. It was an unassuming vessel, its contents obscured, save for a strange interior glow. Undoubtedly, the scribe of House Light has examined these, Eris said. Why bring one to me? Ido ain't exactly a darkness expert. I see. She felt the grooves and patterns under her fingertips as she turned the reliquary in her hands. She felt the shift and shudder of the darkness as it responded to her touch, to her silent inquiry. She ran the pad of her thumb over the seal's edges. When Drifter had first offered the relics to her, Eris had called them a gift. Now that she has one in her hands, she did not think she should unwrap it. She looked back to him. What is your motivation for helping the Guardian? I do not assume altruism. Drifter gave her a look of mock offense. Hey, why not? I did not assume deflection. Speak plainly. Drifter fell silent for a moment. His face was pensive. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen. The Elixni need a win, he said, looking away from her. After that, the Vex, salvation, everything. House Light needs a win. And defeating Aramis will be a win? Yeah, hope it sticks this time. Drifter leaned back on his heels and grinned. Plus, always nice to be owed a favor. Don't know if Spider will make good on this, but I bet Captain Kell would. Again, deflection. She placed the reliquary down on her work table. Drifter didn't move to pick it up. You sure you don't want to keep him? His tone was genuine. Eris considered this. Not the offer, but the sentiment behind his words, the implicit, unspoken faith. You trust me? He shrugged. Who wouldn't? There was a smile, slight, careful at the corner of her mouth, something close to delight. Then stay, be silent and listen. I have thoughts on their utility. Drifter did as she asked. An ether fizz, Spider called to the dreg behind the bar. For our fearless Kell. Spider sat on his makeshift throne at the back of the ether tank, surveying his tiny fiefdom. He beckoned Mithrax to approach. To what do we owe the honor of your presence, Mithrax Kell? Spider asked loudly, overpronouncing the human version of his name. Surely you have more important people to see than a humble entrepreneur like myself, those at the top of the tower, for instance. Mithrax noted a few sharp scoffs among the crowd at the Spider's mention of the tower. I wish to make clear the rules of the Elixni Quarter, Mithrax said, so that there is no misunderstandings. Of course, Spider proclaimed with faux deference. Misunderstandings are how people get left behind. We wouldn't want that. Mithrax huffed at Spider's indelicate allusion. His retort was interrupted by polite chitter at his side. He looked down to see the drag from behind the bar proffer a small ether canister. Mithrax attached the ether canister to his rebreather and took a sharp pull. He was pleasantly surprised by the sensation. It was at once filling and effervescent. The House of Light had been living on the most basic ether for so long that he forgot how delightful such concoctions were. Spider noticed the Kel's appreciation and scoffed. "So, the rules," he prompted. "Yes," Mithrax rumbled. "We are not yet welcomed by all in the last city, so we must avoid angering our human neighbors." "Agreed," Spider nodded. "The humans can be peevish, especially when you kill dozens of them at a time." Mithrax ignored the jab and pressed on. "That is why there must be no violence inside the city walls. Ever." "This is the Elixni Quarter, is it not?" Spider bristled. "The Elixni should be free to mete out justice as needed, in our own way." "I did not say there must be no violence," Mithrax muttered in Satavachi. "Only that it must not happen inside the walls." Spider nodded at the concession. "Very crafty." "Agreed. Is that all?" "No, that is not all. From today forward, there will be no more docking in your organization." He nodded toward the drag behind the bar, whose lower arm stumps were covered with studded leather caps. "What?" Spider exclaimed. "That's preposterous. Elixni have been docking since the whirlwind. It's tradition." The crowd murmured restlessly at the prospect of confrontation. "Not in my house," Mithrax boomed, and the room went silent. Mithrax turned to address the crowd. "I am Kel, and I decree that no Elixni in the House of Light shall be docked." He turned back to the Spider and lowered his voice. "Unless you wish to be the exception to the rule." Spider chuckled. "There's the Mithrax I knew," he said slyly. "As long as you're still willing to draw blades when the time comes, we'll be just fine." Crow leaned against a wooden stool in the dark interior of the ether tank, listening to Spider's wet snores as he dozed fitfully in his chair. It was the small hours of the morning, and the Elixni Quarter was quiet, aside from the low chattering of the scattered Elixni guards and the electric hum of the Spider's gaudy signage. Crow had slipped easily into the empty bar. Crow had carefully stuck a knife into the stool beside him, perfectly placed so that Spider would see it when he woke. Spider coughed softly. Crow looked at the big Elixni, took a measured breath, and saw him plainly as someone sleeping alone in a city of enemies. He looked around the tawdry interior of the bar, decorated with what scraps Spider had managed to bring as he fled the shore for the safety of the last city, where he now survived in the charity of Drifter and Mithrax alone. Crow shook his head with a smile and pulled the knife from the stool before sliding it into his sheath. He was at the doorway before he heard a fizzling noise behind him. Glint materialized in midair. "What are you doing?" Crow hissed, but the ghost was already zipping towards Spider. "Hey!" Glint yelled, and Spider snorted himself awake. Glint increased his lights to a dazzling gleam and hovered aggressively before Spider's face. The Elixni recoiled and raised his arms, but Glint wove between them like an angry bee. "Crow may be too nice to send a message," he shouted, "but I'm not." "What?" Spider managed before he erupted in a fit of confused coughing. "We're watching you," Glint snarled, his voice quivering with tension. "And if you step out of line, so help me, I'll deal with you myself." Spider caught his breath and sat motionless as the little ghost fluttered furiously before him. "And don't," Glint lurched forward and bopped himself against Spider's faceplate with a thunk. "You," Crow covered his mouth as Glint delivered another ludicrous bonk. The Elixni blinked, too shocked to react. "Forget it," Glint shouted, his voice breaking. He whirled his shell defiantly before transmatting away, plunging Spider into darkness once more. Crow was still laughing as the pair approached the lift to the tower. Glint hung sheepishly in the air. "I'm sorry," Glint said. "I guess I didn't have to do that." "Actually," Crow replied, reaching up to scratch his friend's shell, "I think you did." Saint 14 and Lord Shack stood shoulder to shoulder outside the ether tank, Spider's establishment in the Elixni Quarter. They were kitted out with full armor and close quarters arsenal. Shax unholstered his sidearm and confirmed that the clip was full. Saint stared at the bar's entrance and slowly spun the cylinder on his hand cannon with a methodical click, click, click. They glanced at each other and shared a nod. They were ready for trouble. When the Titans stepped through the saloon doors, the whole crowd froze. The Guardians towered above the seated patrons, their helmeted heads the blank visages of death. They slowly stalked the perimeter of the room, moving in opposite directions, optimizing their fields of fire, prioritizing their targets. The humans in the room slowly crept toward the exit and, once clear of the doorway, bolted into the night. The Elixni edged their many heads toward wire rifles and arc spears. There was a moment of silence before the coming storm. A short time later, disarray filled the room. Elixni lay strewn across the floor, dregs cowered behind the bar. In the center of the chaos stood three wretches facing off against Saint 14, his fist crackled with arc energy. The wretches approached in a line, holding hands to create a chain. Then, slowly, solemnly, the two wretches on either end reached out in unison and grabbed Saint's fist. The wretches' cloth wrappings sizzled, and the lenses on their helmet flared as the arc coursed through them. However, they did not break contact, and the circuit remained intact. From a nearby table, Shax's massive voice counted out, 7, 8, 9, 10. Saint let his light ebb, and the wretches staggered backward. There was a moment of silence before Shax boomed, and the winner is the Skiff Blades. Halsix, a vandal in service to the Guardian, leapt into the arms of the wretches, and the four of them bounced up and down in jubilation. An Elixni lying on the floor feebly lifted their upper arms in celebration. The next round, Shax continued, is on the Great Titan, the Violet King, the Saint. Saint 14 nodded grudgingly to the dreg behind the bar, who was peering over the edge in apprehension. Any Elixni who could still walk began mobbing the bar for a concoction at the Titans excitedly. Yes, you're welcome, Saint replied dourly. But don't get used to it. I will not fall for the same scheme again. Today will live in infamy, Shax declared, clapping Saint on the back. The day the hero of 6 fronts was bested by 3 wretches and 8 litters of rotgut. Saint harumphed. This is why I prefer pigeons to people, he muttered. The datapad hit the tiled floor with a sharp crack as it slipped from Ido's shaking hands. Jumping to her feet, she scrambled to pick it up, inspecting hurriedly for damage. Her shoulders slumped slightly as her eyes landed on the thin fracture across its face. Ido took a breath, ether hissing through her rebreather. It didn't calm her. She stood within one of the half-ruined rooms of the Elixni Quarter. Privacy was a luxury in this place, and Ido took it where she could. Now, staring at her datapad, she was even more grateful for the quiet. Aramis had heard Ido recording her scribe's logs. What else had Aramis intercepted? All of House Light's communications? The petitions to the city for supplies? The transactions for the ether tank? Her father's instructions to his people? Ido knew that this wasn't possible, or shouldn't be, but her scribe's logs were unencrypted. She realized now how naive that had been. She took another breath. Ido had reached out to Aramis before, calling for Elixni unity, and did not think she would receive a reply. But now she knew that Aramis had listened. The Kel had reached out in turn. When Aramis interrupted her scribe's logs, there had been pain in her voice. A pain Ido had never known, a pain she had realized her father had tried to keep from her. Ido, Mizrak said, appearing at the threshold of the door. His voice was gentle, but Ido flinched nonetheless as her thoughts broke apart. It was worse somehow, hearing him speak gently. She turned over the cracked datapad as if to hide what she had transpired. Yes, Mizrak's Kel? She answered, too clipped. He bowed his head. Ido stared at her father's silhouette offset by the crumbling building. Silence hung between them for a long moment. "The Guardian has returned," he said, eyes averted. "We have collected another relic." Even now, there was so much unsaid. "A relic of Nezarec," she finished flatly for him. He had known since the beginning. He had known and he had lied, while Aramis had not turned away from the truth. Mithrax said nothing. Ido had been insulted, hurt, and she knew deep down he would not apologize for any of it. "I will study it once I am finished with my scribe's logs," Ido said. She turned away from him, and soon her father's footsteps faded. She looked back to the datapad as if Aramis would speak to her again, now that Mithrax had left, but there was nothing. Ido sighed, her thoughts still racing. Aramis had said she could not turn away from her violence or her vengeance. Ido did not believe that. She could not believe it. This violence was not the Kel's spirit. Ido had to find the part of Aramis that did not rage at the past. Ido had to show the Kel of Darkness a future. Silently, the scribe of House Light began piecing together the coordinates to the next hideout herself. The console went dark. The message had ended. Aramis knew there would not be another. "Come home, Aramis." Aramis closed her eyes. The words settled into the Kel's thoughts. They were heavy, sharp. She felt herself bleed with them. She had begged for death in the moment that Mithrax's blades were at her throat, and his mercy was a deeper wound than any. It was reopened now by the kindness of a child. Aramis remembered her home. Her home was Rhys, devastated by the Great Machine. Her home was Athris, her mate, sleeping in a ship long since departed from this system. Her home was her hatchlings at her mate's side. Aramis remembered watching them grow and molt, how they had chittered their delight and looked at her with their wide, luminous eyes. She would give her house to see those eyes again. But the brightness she had seen in Ido's eyes was a wide, blinding terror, not only of the hive, of her. "Come home, Aramis." Aramis lived. She lived and knew what the Elixni had lost. The dream of a new Rhys was delicate and beautiful. Aramis had held it in her hands, close to her chest for so long. She knew now that she had smothered it. In all the violence, in all the death that followed her, she curled her hands into fists. The dream of a new Rhys would have died with Ido if she had been left to the hive in their putrid light. But Ido did not know Rhys, and neither did her father. They could look beyond that loss. "Come home, Aramis." Aramis knew she would never see anything but terror in another's eyes. Aramis knew that the Elixni would find a new home with Ido. Aramis knew there was no place for her in it.